Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. I'm your host, Dave Vance. Tonight's show will be different than most since we'll be talking about history rather than politics. Then I'll do a short reminder at the end of tonight's broadcast of upcoming legislation in committee this week. Our guest tonight is Rick Revel, who is also involved with the local SCV, that's Sons of Confederate Veterans, and is very knowledgeable on the history of this area during the Civil War. With the pending release of the new movie titled Civil War and the term being tossed around so freely lately, tonight we will focus on how the war impacted the citizens, not just the soldiers. I don't think most people understand all the ramifications of a civil war and how it would impact them and their everyday lives. Rick is one of the more unique guests I've had on this show. He's an award-winning musician, songwriter, actor, reenactor, author, history buff, and longtime member and leader of the local SCV. You can find out more about Rick at rickrevel.com. Rick, thanks for being with us tonight. How are you doing?
Good to be here.
You're not alone. You brought some props.
Well, Kevin mentioned earlier, he said, yeah, do you have anything that you might want to bring? And I said, well, can I pitch my tent? So I thought we'd pitch the tent, and I will spend the night afterwards. And then this is my sword. Actually, during reenacting, I was actually part of a cavalry unit. Started out with the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, which was actually considered forest escort.
Oh, okay.
And then I transferred over to the 7th Tennessee Cavalry, and that's where my ancestors, the Revels, they were part of the 7th Tennessee Cavalry.
And that's R-E-V-E-L, not R-E-B-E-L, but yes. Either's fine, right?
Either's fine, but Revel, R-E-V-E-L. And this was my saber for the when I fought in cavalry, and then this is my Sharps carbine. But this is considered a Confederate Sharps. It was made in the Atlanta, Georgia area. So, and then of course I wanted just to have a nice little camp table, and we have our water in our tin cups, much like what the soldiers might have had during the period. Similar to the canteen back there. Have a First National flag. That's one of our props. Of course, we have the Stars and Stripes too. So the Civil War, it was definitely alive and well in Tennessee. This part of Tennessee, West Tennessee area, had a lot of Civil War action.
Well, tell us a little bit about, maybe mention some of the major battles, but how the locals were affected by it. Because, you know, usually we think about, and when we talk about the Civil War, we think about the battles, the mass casualties, the generals, and all those type things, but we don't really think about the local populace and what they went through. And since most of the war was fought in the South, that's where most of the civilians would have been impacted by it.
Sure. And I think one of the themes of the show is talking about the Civil War movie that's going to be released in April.
Right.
And when people hear the word or the term Civil War, they think about the American Civil War, the 1860s. This movie is not about that. It's about if a war took place today, what would happen. And I think that's what we want to consider in today's program is what would happen to the civilians back home? How would they suffer? What would take place? After the Battle of Fort Donelson, which was the larger battle closest to Paris, Tennessee, and then after the Battle of Shiloh, those two big battles, pretty much West Tennessee was left wide open, and most of Middle Tennessee in the Stewart County area. So a lot of that area was left open. There was no Confederate soldiers. It was Union occupied. And Ulysses S. Grant, which was over the soldiers at the time, actually signed a petition, an order, and it was martial law. And martial law was committed over this area, which means if you had a sheriff or a local police department, most of the time it's just a sheriff or constables, they become powerless. Their ability to go out and maintain peace in the hometown become fruitless, because once you're under martial law, that means the army, the federal soldiers that occupied the area, you were under their rule, under their law. That's what martial law is, which means now you're under the provost marshal of the United States Army. And so you're having to answer to somebody in a blue uniform, not your local sheriff that you elected. And so a lot of that was taking place in the area under martial law. With martial law, it became a power struggle. It became about power when the local cavalry would ride into your town. They had control.
Right.
And let's say they rode up to your house and you had a yard full of chickens, and they were hungry, they could go commandeer all your chickens, wouldn't have to pay you anything. You would get mad and upset. You would run, if you still had a constable in the town or a sheriff in the town, you could run to them and say, hey, they're stealing my items, they're stealing my chickens. Can't you do anything? The local police, the local sheriff, they would say, no, we cannot do anything. So at that time, the law would be up to the Union Army, what they would say would take place. So you were totally subject to that. United States Army that was stationed in Fort Donelson, that was their main fort, they came through Paris, Tennessee quite a bit. So there are a lot of records of things that took place in this area. It was a very uncomfortable time. All the men that lived here, for the most part, unless you were an elder gentleman that was not physically able to go fight, everybody that was able, they were gone.
Right.
And the Confederate Army had moved on toward Chattanooga and eventually wound up in Georgia. So most of the husbands and sons, that's where they were.
Right.
All the women were left to tend to the house, to tend to the farm. They were left pretty much helpless.
Were there no home guard units in this area?
There were a few, but they were outnumbered. And most of your home guard units would eventually fall in with people like Nathan Bedford Forrest. That's who he would wind up recruiting a lot, would be your home guard. But the home guard would be so badly outnumbered, they were rendered useless also. Right. So home guard, you think of the home guard, you think of the movie Cold Mountain, and the home guard from there. Right. Were there units here? Yes, there were units, but those units become considered what was called bushwhackers. And guerrilla warfare took place a lot. In my book about In the Hills of Tennessee, we talk about Jack Henson's son, and Robert was part of what they called Henson Shotgun Cavalry. And that was his job in Stewart County. He had about 25 to 30 men, sometimes it's close to 40 men. And these young men, that's exactly what they would do. They would just constantly badger the Union Army. And if they caught the Union Army stealing hogs or cattle, they would go in literally and chase off. It's usually a small group that's doing the robbing and the pillaging. Right. It's usually 7, 10, 15 men, and so Robert's men would run in and chase them off. But it's known that even during some of that up in the LBL area, the land between the rivers, as it's called then, they were known to take on a company strength, which would be 100+ men. They were known to take on a company, or at least a time or two, they took on 2 companies of men up in the peninsula area of the land between the rivers. When they found these men out there, the 5th Iowa Cavalry, as they were called then, the 5th Iowa Cavalry kind of rampaged through the area. And they would go through there, and Robert's men would chase them off and literally ride right into them with their little sawed-off shotguns and fight and chase them off. And so we did have units that tried to do that, but they were so badly outnumbered, and there was not that many of them. There was just a handful.
Not overall effective as far as security for the locals.
No, because most of the men were gone off fighting in the big army. So small units like Robert's, and he probably had the largest of the small units. So the women were at the mercy of whatever took place. Jack Henson was so concerned about his family, he actually moved them from Stewart County over to Sulphur Wells community, which was the Mormon community over there, which Sulphur Wells is now underwater. The big sandy pump house and all that that area, Springville pump house and all that area, that's underwater now because of Kentucky Lake. But at one time, Sulphur Wells Academy, which was a Mormon church. If you ever wonder, if you see that sign driving down the Lake Highway out there, and you see which says Sulphur Wells Academy, that was a Mormon academy, and an academy was both a school and a church at the same time. So it was a church that was located in that area, and he moved his family there with hopes that they would be safe. He had some kinfolks that were there, but they weren't always safe. Right. He had to leave them somewhere, but there was an uncle that lived there, so at least there was one man that could help watch his wife and children. Not far from that location, in the Buchanan area, there was a woman that writes in her memoirs that all the male counterparts were away. She did have one son at home that was too young to fight at that time. And they were known in the community for the type of hams. They raised hogs. So they were known for the hams that they would be curing. And the Union patrol kept coming through stealing their hams. And so she was determined to figure out, how can I hide my hams where they won't steal them? So she hid them in the loft of their barn and hid them under the hay, and they got wise to it. And one of the men, they showed up. There was about two of them that showed up at this particular raid, and one went upstairs. And when he was coming back down, she had her butcher knife with her. And when he's coming down the steps with a ham over his shoulder, she stabbed and killed him. And her son then takes out the other man in blue uniform, and they then take both the bodies out to the hog pen and feed the hogs.
19th century disposal unit.
Garbage disposal,
Garbage
as they would
disposal.
look at it at that time, yeah.
Yeah.
So that, it sounds gruesome, but this is in the memoirs of somebody that had to survive.
Right.
And this was what she had to go through, because she had no husband to take care of her. There was no grown men that could take care of her. So she had to fend for herself. And we had talked about it off camera. There was tons and tons of cases where the women were vulnerable, and they would be, we call the term rape and pillage. Well, they
It's
were
a real term. It really means something.
It means something.
Yeah.
It's not just something that you phrase about a movie that you're watching where the Roman army rapes and pillages, and no, this was happening in America, where you actually had armies coming in because you're under martial law. Local law has no power. And so they come in, and in McKenzie, Tennessee, in the Carroll County area, a young girl writes in her memoirs where in the area they were burning down. They burned down the boys' college, the girls' college. They were torching a lot of different places. They came by her house where they lived. No men, no males, all females. They were also a young black girl that was with them that was a house servant. They had a dog, and as the Union soldiers come into the house, the dog is defensive.
Right.
And so the dog's barking. They pull a pistol. They threaten to kill the dog. The young black girl says, "Please don't kill the dog." So she carries it upstairs, tried to keep the dog from being injured, and the dog gets away, runs back down the stairs to attack one of the soldiers. They kill the dog. All the girls are crying, but that means nothing. Now the men proceed not only to steal all the silverware, all the valuables in the house. The ladies are vulnerable, and they take advantage of the ladies.
And that's not an uncommon story
Not
here or
uncommon.
anywhere
That's right.
in the South during the Civil War.
It took place a lot. Yes, it did. And so that's something they faced, and that's in actual memoirs that you can find in the library and the archives there in McKenzie, Tennessee, in that library.
If I'm not mistaken, you can find it in the letters from some of the Union soldiers.
Oh, yeah.
I remember reading about that in other publications.
Right.
So that is something that happened. Now, you mentioned a minute ago that they burned the colleges. What was the purpose of burning the colleges?
It was kind of not Sherman wasn't here, but just the general mentality was, when we think of burning in the scorched earth policy of Sherman, we think that maybe he was the only one that did it. But no. Grenville Dodge did it. Most anybody that you can trace down in this area, what they wanted to do was break the will of the people.
Right.
And so they would burn churches, they would burn any educational...
They burnt churches?
Any educational facility. They would burn courthouses.
Yeah.
So they would go in, and anything that was significant to the
people.
community,
Right.
something that was that object, their centerpiece of the town was the courthouse, it would be one of the first things to get burned. And then any outlying building, it could be burned. But churches, Stewart County, there was 2 or 3 churches torched there because they would feel that these people if they had anything to do with the South, they would torch that church, especially if they felt it was a place that could be a meeting, because there was so much resistance going on, guerrilla warfare going on.
Right.
A lot of times they'd say, well, there's a meeting taking place at that church. And so they would burn that church. If they had any suspicion whatsoever that something was taking place at that church that shouldn't, they would burn it. It happened in Humphreys County, near Waverly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So it happened a lot. Matter of fact, Robert, when he was captured once, it was not too far from Waverly, Tennessee, in Humphreys County, and he was attending a church service when it happened.
An actual church service, not
an actual church service,
right.
And because his wife was from that area, his wife's family was from that area. So,
wow.
Even financial institutions fell prey. Now, here's another thing that happened. You've heard the term carpetbaggers.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Carpetbaggers we think of was post-war. Carpetbaggers were all during the war as well as post-war. Carpetbaggers would come in, the Union Army, keep in mind it's now martial law.
Right.
Nobody local has any power or say-so whatsoever. Your local newspaper, it would be, if you were not of the Northern persuasion or a Union sympathizer, if you were a proven Southern sympathizer, you were replaced. Somebody from the North would come in to publish the paper. If they couldn't find somebody from the North to publish the paper, they would burn and destroy the press and burn wherever it was, whatever the business establishment was, they'd burn it. It happened in Dover.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it happened in Dover. So that happened quite often. The thing they wanted to do was make sure if you had a business, let's say that before the war you had a business, they would, and you were all fighting the war, the first thing they would do, they'd come in town and they'd find out if, and most of the time it'd be the women still trying to run the business. Let's say it was a mercantile. If you're running a mercantile and it's just your wife running it, and you're off in Georgia fighting, if they find out that you're a major or some officer, that's instant. Your wife's out of there. The business no longer belongs to you. This colonel or whoever's in charge of the town sent a telegraph to a friend back in Chicago, St. Louis, or wherever he's from, wherever the colonel's from. He says, hey, got this store, you want to come run it?
Wow.
And that's taking place during the war. So carpetbaggers were alive and well during the war, not post-war.
Right.
It started during the war.
Well before, yeah.
Well before. So all that began, so you had carpetbaggers coming in doing all those things to take over businesses. Newspapers were the biggest thing. The Memphis Appeal, now called the Commercial Appeal, they were trying their best to print things that were trying to teach, the truth as we'd call it.
Right.
They were trying to, say, hey, we're being invaded. To arms, we're being invaded. And so the first thing they did when they came down the Mississippi and they took over, when the Union Army came down the Mississippi and took over Memphis, first thing they did, they took over the paper. But the people that run the paper had to escape. And so some of them took some print press with them so they could
Go somewhere else.
So they load it in a wagon and they'd go to a friendly town and they would set up shop and they'd print papers. One of the other characters, Todd Carter, from the Battle of Franklin, he became the Mint Julep. And he actually worked with the people that escaped Memphis, who started printing an outlaw paper, you might as well call it, because they were trying to escape the Union Army. And he would write for them as the Mint Julep, so he was a war correspondent.
Wow.
And so that's one of the ways they had to keep the message out there. So they had portable print presses, so they would take it to the southern friendly town, whoever would give them a home, and they'd print the stories. So
a real dangerous man on the street job, huh? Yes.
It was amazing what the people in the South, how innovative they had to become. I think the thing is the women and the children, what they had to go through was probably the toughest job of all. They're men. Now, what they were having to go through was terrible. Picture it. At nightfall, for a Union soldier, they would ride into camp or march into camp. There would be a mess wagon already there. There would be an assigned cook. They would be preparing food, and usually you had a cook per company, and they are a mess company, as they would call it. And these men would gather around, and they knew who the cook was, and they actually had food that would be cooked.
Right.
Confederate soldier would get in at night. Most of them had a mess company, and they had to pitch in together. Whatever food they were able to forage or be issued.
Right.
And most of the time it was, maybe a handful of corn. And we talk a lot about hardtack. Well, the Union Army had plenty of hardtack. You ever heard of the Nabisco Company? You know what Nabisco?
Yeah.
Oh, Nabisco.
Yeah.
It's the National Biscuit Company.
Okay.
It started during the Civil War, and they made hardtack.
Yeah. I didn't know that, but I knew they'd been around a good while.
Been around a long time. And so, but they were mainly producing it for the Union Army.
Right.
And about the time the South could wind up with it, if they had somebody that could make some for them, or they would capture it on a supply train from the Union Army.
Right.
So the Confederate soldier, salt pork, they eat a lot of salt pork, but most of the time it's things they could forage. And a lot of times it'd be nothing but just corn. And they would take that corn, put it in a frying pan, and parch it. And they'd eat parched corn, kind of like you'd eat grains of popcorn.
Right.
You'd eat the parched corn. And that's what they had to survive on.
Remember my grandmother telling me, my grandmother was born in 1900, so she had two uncles, both Civil War veterans, actually one for one side and one for the other. But she told me about one of them saying that they were so hungry during the war that they came across some place and they were slopping the hogs there, and they were like, hey, can we have that instead of you giving it to the hogs?
Hey.
What about as far as food for the civilians? Because what was their situation like as far as food goes?
Well, the women, they tried to keep gardens. They tried to keep as much food growing as they could. Here's an interesting thing. We're taught so many things that are not correct in school. And unless you're willing to take the time to read the right literature and to do your research properly, the due diligence, as we call it, unless you're willing to do that, you're not going to know the real true story. We're taught about, when it gets into the slavery aspect of things, you talk about the horrors of it. Most of your families that did have slaves, and we're going to take a time out here, how many families had slaves?
Not a lot.
United States Census said less than 10% of the Southern population owned slaves. But for those who did, now we'll get back to the story. For those who did, if they did have black servants and slaves, they were considered part of the family, and they were all working together to survive. Right. They were raising the crops together. They were in the fields together. We're so ruined by Hollywood.
Yeah.
All we see is Gone with the Wind and Scarlett O'Hara. That's all we see. We don't see the real truth. And the real truth is, these women were out in the fields. The white women were standing right next to the blacks, and they were all hoeing. They were all trying to get the corn to grow, whatever crops they could raise. But far as cotton, the market for cotton was gone.
Right.
They wrecked the market for cotton.
Yeah.
The Morrill Tariff Act, that was one of the things that triggered the war.
Right.
And so, and for those that do not know what that is, basically, in essence, it's a tariff. And so, when the southern cotton was shipped out, there was a tax put on it. When it went to Europe and was made into a fine garment or curtains or drapes or whatever and shipped back to America, there was another tax put on it. So it's double taxed. So when you went to the store to buy it, what was worth $1 is now worth $5, $10, $12.
Which was a whole lot more money then than it is now.
Right. And so the South knew this. And so when the war begins, here we are. When you go to the store to buy things, nobody has any money to begin with. We're just now coming out of the barter system. Think about it. The country had been working off the barter system for years. And so you're just now getting people used to using currency. The paper currency is fairly new in terms of people having a pocket full of cash. They may have a pocket full of coins, and it'd be silver and gold. But all that was hard to come by also.
Yeah.
So most of the time you'd say, hey, you know, I'll do a trade with you. That hog right there, I'll trade that hog for, maybe that calf right there. That's a full-grown hog. I'll trade that full-grown hog to that calf. You think that's a fair trade? And that was the barter system. Instead of saying, I will pay you $10 for that. $10 was hard to come by back then.
Right.
And so the women back home had that same problem. They couldn't go out and buy anything. If they did have any money at all, things had gone up from, and I've looked it all up, it's just amazing how 50 cents you would pay for a pound of sugar had gone up to $5 or $6 a pound, which today, what are you giving? That kind of gets like, that's equal today to what you're paying for it today.
Right.
And this is at a time when things don't cost.
The inflation rate would have been a lot higher.
Yeah. So things were jumping up that high. You could not get coffee. So they began to take chicory and make coffee out of chicory. So they became very innovative in how they would survive. Their clothing would be worn out. There was a thing called a blockade. The federal government
immediately blockaded.
Yeah, on all your ports coming in, like New Orleans, all the whole peninsula, the whole panhandle of Florida, everything. There's federal ships everywhere preventing any Confederate supplies from coming in, or just supplies in general were commandeered and sent to the Union forces. So no supplies could get into the South, no food, nothing. Medical supplies. It was very interesting. I'm going to jump back to the other story and finish it before I get into the medical supplies. But the women that were on the farm, what they wound up having to do was saying, hey, we have no money. We can't go to the store to buy it. We have to grow everything. And so that's what they wound up doing pretty much for survival for the 4 years they were out without their family, their male counterparts.
But there was no guarantee that wasn't going to be destroyed or taken off. And
that's the downside.
There was nothing to prevent them from coming and taking everything. And I know, I do want to bring this up real quick.
Yep.
There's a book called Union Terror that I read, and there's a part 2 coming out. This is from Dr. Jeffrey Addicott at St. Mary's University in Texas. He's a former Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel. He was also in the AG branch. And this book talks about a lot of the official Union policy during this time.
Right.
And I mean, we didn't have a Geneva Convention, but we did have rules of war at that time.
Right.
And even in here, it talks about, some of the Union officers are like, well, hey, what is going on here?
Right.
Even some of them were not happy with what was allowed to go on and allowed, under Sherman, under Grant. And Lincoln knew about a lot of this stuff. He was not left in the dark. And I don't think it's actually in this book. I think it was another that I was reading. And I think it was Sheridan that said it. You may know. But this was directed towards the South in general, the civilians, not the soldiers, the civilians. But leave them with nothing but their eyes to cry.
Right.
And I think I'm pretty sure that was Sheridan that said that. Are you familiar with that? Have you ever heard of that? Mm-hmm. And I know you mentioned Louisiana. I think it was Butler, General Butler, was it, down in they called him the Beast?
Yes.
For the way he even encouraged his soldiers to treat.
Benjamin Butler was his name. And an interesting thing about Butler, do you realize how many in New Orleans? Let's take this. New Orleans, there were 700 free people of color who owned slaves. Mm-hmm. Okay?
Big plantations.
Big plantations. These were sugar plantations. These were sugar cane plantations.
Right.
And so one of the largest sugar cane plantations was owned by a black family.
Right.
She was considered a mulatto. Her father was white, he was French. Mother was black. Father's dead. Her brother's all fighting the war. Her brother actually fights at Shiloh.
For the Confederacy.
For the Confederacy.
Yep.
He was a mulatto. The whole regiment were black and mulatto that came in, and they fought at Shiloh.
Wow, I didn't know that.
From New Orleans, yes. The 6th Louisiana. She is manning or over the plantation, trying to hold things together. Butler comes in and burns the entire place.
Wow. Sugar plantation,
And
that's a real threat, huh?
Yeah, and she's a black proprietor.
Wow.
That is not taught in American history.
No.
So that does raise a lot of questions. Why, if you're there to free the slaves, why are you burning their plantation?
Yeah, well,
And that happened not just once, it happened several times, but I'm familiar with her story because her brother winds up
in Shiloh.
in Shiloh and in Tennessee.
And I think, matter of fact, I think you're the one that told me this, and I didn't know this. I knew that Grant had slaves, or his wife's family had slaves, but I think you mentioned something about Vicksburg the other day when we were talking.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're always talked about, all these Confederates all had slaves. We're told they all had slaves, and that's why they...
Or they all wanted them.
Yeah.
That's one of the later things. Well, okay, they didn't have them, but they wanted
them.
They wanted to make sure that someday they could have some.
But they failed to study the full course of history. And Grant, before the war, you have to remember he was a civilian before the war. He did not continue in the military the entire time. After the Mexican War was over, he tried several things. He tried to run a store. He tried to be a shoe salesman. He tried to do several things in civilian life and failed at all of them.
Right.
His last job before he became an officer again, and he was given a field commission actually he was a colonel first before he became a brigadier. But in civilian life, his wife Julia, her father owned a plantation. Ulysses S. Grant, was the farm foreman of the plantation. The overseer.
Where was the plantation at?
This is going to be up in...
Illinois?
It's in
Southern
Illinois, right across the river from St. Louis. Here's
Okay.
St. Louis, and it's right across the river. And he was the foreman, over 35 slaves, at the outbreak of the war. When he leaves that farm, that plantation, to join up and form a regiment.
Right.
And so when the war begins, he winds up in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Julia wants to come visit and brings 3 slaves with her to Vicksburg, Mississippi.
Was anything said? I mean, did that not raise a stir?
But it's amazing to me.
Yeah.
And you actually can find that information on a metal plaque down in Mississippi where they stayed on their travels. They stayed one night in a little town, and they put a plaque up talking about the 3 slaves that belonged to Julia.
And there was Sherman, who, of course, his march to the sea and all the havoc he wreaked in Georgia and South Carolina. Now, I've always heard this, and I actually think it may have been in his book as well. He did spend some time in an insane asylum before the war, correct?
Well,
or is that an exaggeration?
It is and it's not. He had a mental breakdown. There's an interview in Louisville, Kentucky, and it's during this time he's on leave. He's actually been given a leave after Shiloh. He's been given a leave, and there is an interview to take place. I think it's in Louisville, Kentucky, and he gets so mad he threatens to kill the reporter.
Wow. So
he was not a stable individual. There were several occasions. Because before the war, you know what he was doing before the war? He was teaching in New Orleans. He was in New Orleans teaching.
Yeah.
And as he comes out of New Orleans, he's one of the first to speak out. And it's said that Grant said something very similar, but he's one of the first to speak out that this war better not be over slavery because he didn't like them. And he said there's no place in our army for blacks. Yeah. He said that. That's Sherman. That's something he said.
Right.
He was not happy when they started having blacks in the units.
Yep.
There was a time under his command in Georgia that there were 500 blacks following because there was refugees.
Right.
You know, the towns and plantations were being burned, so there were some blacks that were refugees, and they were following Sherman's army. And there was a commander that was called Jefferson Davis in the Union Army,
Right.
oddly enough, and they came to a river crossing. Wheeler's cavalry is following them very close. So they get to this river crossing. The Federal Army, which was mainly under Sherman, but you break it down into the division and into the brigade, this was under a Jefferson Davis, General Davis.
I bet he had a hard life.
I bet he did too, having the name of the Confederate president. But they got to this bridge, Wheeler's pressing them, and so they decided to burn the bridge, and they burned it before the refugees could cross it. And a lot of the black refugees drowned there. They say at least, I think the number was 500 that drowned. I think it was a larger number than 500 that was trying to cross. But around 500 have drowned because they were afraid of the cavalry approaching.
Right.
But the Union didn't let them cross. And so there was a large number that died there, but that is never talked about or never reported.
Right.
And so there's a lot of things that Sherman was responsible for that go unrecorded because of the colored uniform he's wearing. So.
Yeah. Well, especially in this book, it talks a lot about the destruction, and it was all about we're going to destroy. If they would take, if they could use it, if they could eat it or use it in some way, shape, or form, they would. Mm-hmm. But it's not like, okay, they just took what they needed and left the rest. No, it's like, okay, we're going to take what we need. Right. What we can't use or take, we're going to destroy. Yeah. We're going to leave you nothing.
Right.
And that was with everybody. We're not talking about soldiers. We're talking about the civilians.
Right. And in Georgia, they call them the bummers. And the Sherman's bummers is exactly what they called them. And Sherman's bummers, when they came in, and how they got their name, there was a federal issue cap, a keepy cap.
Right.
And the keepy was called a slouch because it was larger than normal. It's not what you normally think of as like the French style kepi.
Right.
That's real tight and uniform. Yep. This one had a big slouch on it. So it was a forage cap. And so you could actually take it, if you wanted to go to an orchard and pick apples, you could fill your cap and get a lot of food in that. And so the bummers, as the cap became known as, they would go in and they would steal things from the home. The first thing they would go for is the silverware. First thing always. Well, what are you going to do with silverware? You can't eat it. What are you going to do with it? You're going to sell it.
Yeah. It's
for your profit.
Yeah.
You're not going to use it to go back. I mean, why do you need a whole set of it when all you need is a fork?
Right.
For camp life, that's all you needed was your fork, and you carried your knife on your person.
Yeah.
That you fought with. So why, other than a fork, what do you need? So why are you stealing the whole silverware? It's to sell. Why are you stealing the silverware coffee pot? The platter that it sits on. There's scenes, literally, recorded of men doing those very things, walking off with just armloads of valuables like that. Why? If you're hungry and you need a chicken, that's you can understand that possibly.
Right. And the South did forage some too. I mean, yes, we had to. And not saying that they maybe were always, totally, but I certainly don't think in the South it was the policy to, okay, go get what you want and what you don't take, destroy, and leave the people with nothing.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was considered the last gentleman's war. You would think if it's the last gentleman's war, how could it get so hostile?
Right.
But the Gentleman's War referred more than anything to the way they fought it on the field.
Right.
They would line up here, they'd line up on the opposite side of the field, they would stand in this Napoleonic style battle, and they would fire at one another, and they would advance, and they'd advance. It was considered a gentleman's war. Back home, it was no gentleman's war. Right. It was horrific what the women, the children had to go through. It was a constant, constantly you had to keep watch, had to sleep with one eye open. It was a constant thing. Your biggest relief was if there happened to be a large battle somewhere nearby, especially in Virginia, if there was a large battle, then you knew that's where the federal troops would be going for a while. They'd go toward that large battle, and you might get a short relief period during that time that they were off to fight that battle. But as soon as that battle's over,
They're coming back.
they're coming back to your area, or somebody is in a blue uniform. So that's what you had to go through. Now this area right in here in West Tennessee, it was not only what you would call regular federal troops, but you also had groups. I don't know if you've ever heard of Fielding Hearst.
I've heard of it, but I don't know.
Yeah, Fielding Hearst is called Hearst Nation. Fielding Hearst was a judge from near the Shiloh area, not far from Shiloh, near Purdy, Tennessee, in that area, down in that neck of the woods. If you go to Shiloh, you'll see Purdy Road. Well, he lived out that direction toward Purdy, Purdy, and he had a big, huge plantation down there. He owned several slaves, a lot of slaves. He was a Union colonel, owned slaves, took the slaves with him all the way up down through Tennessee. He went to Jackson, Tennessee, and he did some damage in Jackson. He burnt a few things. He burnt a resident of one of the town council. Some of the people got real upset, so the elders, they actually sued Fielding Hearst and won.
During that time?
Yes, it's $11,000. They won this lawsuit because it was a local lawsuit, so they won it. They were trying to say, you've got to pay it. He says, okay, I'll pay it. I'm going to come in on such and such day, and I'm going to pay it. He came in, and he burnt the town.
Wow.
So he set fire to Jackson, Tennessee.
Now, Tennessee was mixed. I mean, a lot of people think that, especially if they're not from here, they probably all assume, well, all of Tennessee was for the Confederacy, but that was not true at all.
Right.
Especially East Tennessee.
And so here's a Tennessean that puts on a blue uniform. I'll tell you something else that'll kind of make the hair stand up the back of your neck. There was a pretty good size of I think it's close to 100 men out of Huntington, Tennessee, mostly lawyers and people of higher stature, that put together a bushwhacking unit, and they were all Union. And
lawyers and bushwhackers. I think there's a connection there.
That's a connection there.
Yeah.
Yep. And if you go to Huntington, Tennessee, and you see all those antebellum homes that are there, that's where they lived. That's the reason they're still there, because they were Union sympathizers or part of that bushwhacking gang, wearing blue uniforms. And they all became, there was the 6th Tennessee, then there was 10th Tennessee, and I think they were eventually part of the 10th Tennessee, which became a mounted rifle unit.
But now most of the Union units in Tennessee, weren't they in East Tennessee? Is that accurate? Or is it just a mix pretty much?
Just a mix, but most of them rode in this area. The Battle of Fort Pillow, Fielding Hearst men, and a lot of these, what we call galvanized Yankees that were Tennesseans fighting for the North. A lot of them wound up at Fort Pillow when Forrest came through there. So you did have units that formed up that were Tennesseans, wore blue uniforms, and they were the ones you had to watch out for the most.
Right.
Because now it was a Hatfield and McCoy situation.
Funny you should mention that. I'm from West Virginia, and related to the Hatfields distance.
So that's that situation. So this is what the women and children were going through. Wow. Now they're sitting at their home. They've got a group from Huntington, Tennessee. They've got a group from Decatur County, Tennessee. They've got these different ones that are wearing blue uniforms. They got Fielding Hearst from Purdy, Tennessee. You got all these different blue uniforms coming in here, and some of them are homegrown Tennesseans wearing blue uniforms. And your husband is off fighting in the Confederacy. You think you're going to go over well with them? No. So that's why the rape and the pillage thing, it happened, and it happened over and over again. So it was a real thing. So back to if we had a civil war today.
Be even worse.
It would be worse.
It would be different because you wouldn't have as clearly delineated lines, I don't think. And really, even if we had just a grid down incident, or what I'm really concerned about is with all of these people coming across the border,
Right.
Okay, this Fed-led invasion. This I guess
Yes.
you could say this will be the second Fed-led invasion.
Right.
And a lot of the illegals, though not all of them, are coming into the South. And I saw where some judge just ruled that illegal aliens, you can't ban them from having guns. So I guess
crazy?
if you got an invasion force, if it's a Fed-led invasion force, at some point in time they have to have guns. So I
Right.
don't know. I guess they're just planning ahead or whatever. But I mean, it would be so much worse. We're a whole lot less overall self-reliant than what we were. And even though there's a lot of people in this area who've been here, since the Civil War and even prior, there's a lot of people that are not originally from here. It's just
Right.
It would be all kinds of ugly if we have something like that. Whether it's a Civil War, whether it's like I say, the Fed-led invasion, a grid down incident. You name it. It would be. It's not something to hope for. Let's put it that way.
It's not. And I know I see on social media, a lot of people really, well, it's a lot. Just bring it on. Just come on, bring it on. I'm ready for it. Well, I don't care how much of a stockpile of ammunition you personally have. You're not facing a conventional battle to where you walk out in the street with Matt Dillon on one end and the bad guy on the other, and it's whoever's the fastest wins. It's not one of those situations.
Right.
Because if a real civil war takes place, then you have an army tank coming through your town. And that army tank is not going to stop until it runs over everything. Because modern day warfare is how much can you destroy.
Right.
So if it was bad during the Civil War of the 1860s, when it's supposed to be a gentleman's war,
right.
What's it going to be like today what was Europe like after World War II?
No, it was just totally trashed.
It was trashed.
It took them
because the bombers
forever.
kept going over
Yep.
over again to take out the Nazis. It flattened the towns. It was called collateral damage.
Yeah.
We will be collateral damage if there's a civil war.
Yep.
Now, it's kind of like in the opening of Red Dawn when the paratroopers are coming in and they're landing there in that little small town. And you see, I think in the very opening, probably within the first 15, 20 minutes, they're running through the town there, and you see a man laying next to the bumper of his truck, and he's got a .45 Colt in his hand. It looked like a 1911, and he's laying there, and it has a bumper sticker from the NRA. It says, pry it from my cold dead hands,
Right. Right.
But that's the way it'll be.
Right.
Yes, I think we as Second Amendment people would say, come take it.
Right.
And we would probably fight to the very end, but it'll be a quick end because they have the big guns. Or we better get some.
Right. Well,
That's how
I
it
don't
works.
think I don't think it would be. And granted, this movie, I haven't seen the movie yet, and I know it's based on a little different scenario.
Right.
I know it does involve secession and all that, but I'm more worried. I think more likely, rather than it being that, it will be more like kind of like the situation you got going in Haiti now and in other places. That's how I think it will be because
that's how communities need to have the watch list together. So you and I put our quick militia together and go shoulder to shoulder because
right.
that's the only way you can guard against that.
Right.
But if it winds up being something where you have an actual military rolling into your town,
right,
it's going to be tough to fight it.
Right. Well, now, and I will say this too, though, and I'm not clamoring for this, but if you look, places like Iraq and Afghanistan and even Vietnam, I mean, those advantages don't necessarily tell the tale.
No, they don't.
They don't necessarily tell the tale. But it's a tale that we hope is not told. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. Now, having said that, mentioned the Second Amendment, especially with our open border, and especially with the scenario I'm talking about that I think is more likely, that's why I think the Second Amendment is critical. We have to be able to, because the federal government's made it clear they don't care about us.
They don't.
They don't care about protecting us. And we've got all these people over there. If nobody else crossed the border today, and if we had different leadership tomorrow,
right,
I don't know how we get rid of all of them, but if they decided, if they decided to do whatever they came over here to do, because they did not all come over here for jobs or welfare or whatever. A lot of them come over here with evil intent, and just those numbers alone is an argument to not only have full use of our Second Amendment,
right,
but I really think, we need our National Guard we need a state guard with some oomph behind it to protect us from the situation the federal government's created, the potential bad situation that they have created.
And I agree with you on that. I think we always need to be prepared as the men and as the warriors that we're supposed to be, the defenders of the home. I think we all should do that. But when asked about the subject of how will the families fare and the women fare,
it'd be even worse today.
It's going to be bad.
It would be even worse today.
I guess the whole essence is, if it did happen, you're going to have to prepare yourself for it, because just understand that it's not going to be like you're watching a movie. At the very beginning, at the first Battle of Manassas and Bull Run, picnickers actually went out to watch the battle. Yeah. So most of them leave Washington, D.C. They ride out in their chariots and their carriages and their finery and their top hats and their gowns, and they're literally having a picnic to watch the battle. And they think it's going to be over quickly.
Yeah.
And so while they're watching the battle, all of a sudden the tide turns and their boys in blue turn and run over them. Yeah. And a lot of them are injured and killed. And all of a sudden it becomes real.
Yep.
That this can be deadly, and it can affect us.
Yep. And
it will affect us. It'll affect everybody. War is a consuming thing. It will take everything and everybody in its path. It's like a fire. It will burn everything in its path until you put it out.
Right.
And the only way we can put it out is never give up your Second Amendment.
Absolutely.
That's it. You've got to hold on, be able to protect yourself and your family. That's the first and foremost thing. So saying all the things about we must be the protectors of our home, protectors of our territory, yes, but just know the consequence. Every action has a consequence, every.
Right. Yeah.
So there's no exception that you're going to be able to go on a picnic and watch it happen from the sidelines.
Yeah.
You're going to be in the game.
Yeah. There's no mute button. Can't change the channel.
Mm-mm. And that's what happens. There's so many people that are gamers today, and it's not on the computer screen.
Right.
It's going to be in your living room, literally.
Yeah.
So that's the thing we have to be ready for, if it does happen. And I pray it never does.
Right.
I pray that the better judgment will win the day.
Better leadership at all levels.
Hopefully better leadership soon.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't, then be ready to accept what's thrown your direction.
Yeah. Expect it to be all kinds of ugly, because it will be.
It will be all kinds of ugly. Yeah.
Well, hey, thank you for being with us. I'd like to do something like this again.
Yeah.
You bring some more props.
Yes, I'll be glad to do it.
So I've got a few announcements here, but once again, appreciate it.
Yes,
Let me scroll down here. I kind of got behind, but I appreciate everybody for being with us. And I want you to know about some bills that are going to be in committee in Tennessee legislature this week that you need to make a call on. HJR 0005. This is the Convention of the States for Term Limits. It'll be Tuesday in the Senate State and Local Government Committee. Guys, this is very dangerous. I know that the people may be well-intentioned in terms of thinking that term limits will accomplish something. You could debate that one way or the other, but I tell you what, they don't follow the Constitution now, okay? They're not going to follow whatever you come up with out of a convention of the states, because guess what? Our states have not held them to the Constitution as it is. So they'll just ignore whatever comes out of that. The next one is SJR 0904, and speaking of the Second Amendment, or in the case of Tennessee, Section 26 of our Declaration of Rights, which is right up front in our state constitution. And this is an amendment to propose an amendment to Article 1, Section 20. I'm repeating myself here. I got ahead of myself a little bit. to remove the provision that authorizes the legislature to regulate the wearing of arms with a view to prevent crime, and to state that citizens have a right to keep, bear, and wear arms for the defense, not just for the common defense. And that'll be in the Senate Judiciary Committee on the 19th. Now, my understanding is that in the 1870s, after the Civil War, that they added the part about legislating the wearing of weapons with a view to reduce crime. I've been told that that was aimed at making sure that all the recently freed slaves would not be able to arm themselves. Whatever the reason, in this day and age, we need to be able to arm ourselves. And so let's hope that that one gets through. Please call and support that one. That's in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Also, we've got House Bill 0694 and Senate Bill 057. 694 is by Representative Fritz, and Senate Bill 057 is Senator Tripodi. Prohibits a person, political subdivision, or public official in connection with a state emergency from categorizing or proclaiming by order, rule, or regulation that a lawful occupation is non-essential, or otherwise proclaiming by order, rule, or regulation that a lawful occupation is prohibited from operating based on what the lawful occupation is. Specifies that a person harmed by a violation of the prohibition may bring a civil action for actual damages. Now, this references back to during the COVID scamdemic, when our governor decided that some occupations were just not essential. The way you support yourself and your family, it just was not essential, okay? So the goal of this is to make sure that never happens again. So I think that's something that definitely deserves your support. So Senate Bill 0574, it's in the Senate, State, and Local Government Committee tomorrow, and House Bill 0694 is in the State Government Committee on Wednesday. I can't adequately cover all the pending legislation, good or bad, in an hour or even 2 hours. Just understand we're being attacked on every front. I recommend the following links. And actually, before I give these links, I left out one bill, and I mentioned this last night, and I still forgot to add it to the slide deck. House Bill 2000. Don't remember the Senate bill, but just look up House Bill 2000. It allows the AG, within parameters, to set his own salary and that of his subordinates. I've never heard of that. I've never heard of an appointed or an elected official, either way, and he's appointed, not elected, to set their own salary even within parameters. So let's figure out what that one's about. Call your rep and your senator and ask them, hey, why are we allowing the AG, or why would we allow anybody to do that? Now, maybe there's something I'm missing. I can't imagine what it is, but that just does not smell right. Or like I said, I can't keep you updated on everything. There's so many things. They run way too many bills every year. Maybe that's a law for next year, that they not be allowed to run so many bills so we can keep up with them. But for anything having to do with true nullification, which that legislation is in going to summer study, obviously we recommend tncss.weebly.com. Sign up for the Substack letter to keep apprised of what's going on with that. We're not giving up. We feel like, if we can't get something like that through, then we have no long-term future in this country where to keep the federal government just taking control of everything. Anything for Second Amendment related bills, I recommend TennesseeFirearms.com. For legislation covering a variety of topics, I recommend Tennessee Eagle Forum or Tennessee Stands. Thank everybody for watching the program tonight. Be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons, as well as the notification bell to stay informed about our upcoming shows. And as a reminder, you can now listen to us as a podcast on Spreaker.com. You can find all the audio-only podcasts of your favorite episodes on our website, tinformer.com, or do a search for Tennessee Informer on Spreaker.com, where you can also download the Spreaker app for Android or Apple phones. Excited to announce the Tennessee Informer podcasts are now available to listen to on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and several other platforms. Also, take a moment to check out and follow our Facebook page at TN Informer. We'll be posting news and information about upcoming shows on there, as well as our website, tninformer.com, where you can also sign up for a weekly newsletter. We're also on Twitter now as well, twitter.com/tninformer. All right, so this is probably going to catch some flack, but here it is. We're also on TikTok as well, where we can push back against the communist propaganda from China and the communist propaganda from the Biden administration. Please share us with your friends so they too can stay up to date on all the conservative political news and issues concerning our great state. Our guest next week will be West Tennessee Director of the TFA, Richard Archie. He'll update us on pending firearms legislation, plus some of the underhanded shenanigans being used by the rhinos against our efforts to pass pro-Second Amendment legislation. Hope you'll join us. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.